The transport shuttle's emergency beacon lit up the colony's COM network at 0400 hours, and Dr. Amara Okonkwo knew immediately that something had gone catastrophically wrong. She'd been expecting this, cold reading it. Really ever since the Thal'kari delegation had arrived 3 months ago with their rigid protocols and territorial instincts. What she hadn't expected was Alpha Version himself, standing in her office doorway at dawn, his amber eyes burning with barely contained fury, while his claws scored deep marks into her doorframe. "My cubs," he growled, the subsonic rumble shaking the windows, "have been missing for 4 days. Your people were the last to see them." Amara kept her voice steady even as her heart hammered. "Alpha, I understand your concern, but accusing us of..." She stopped as Version's mane flared, the bioluminescent patterns along his neck pulsing red with aggression. Behind him, 3 Thal'kari warriors filled the corridor, their presence a clear threat. "My daughter Kira, my son Zaylan, my youngest, Mera. They attended your cultural exchange program Tuesday. They never returned home." His massive hand slammed onto her desk, cracking the composite surface. "Where are they?" The truth was, Amara didn't know, and that terrified her more than Version's rage. She pulled up the security logs, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated the interface. The footage showed the 3 cubs, barely adolescents by Thal'kari standards, their manes still short and their spots not yet faded, leaving the education center with a group of human children. They were laughing, playing some kind of game that involved jumping and mockfighting. Then they simply walked toward the western residential quarter and disappeared from the monitored zones. "They went with the children voluntarily," Amara said carefully. "There's no sign of coercion, but Version was already leaving, his warriors falling in behind him, and she could hear him issuing commands in the clicking, roaring language of his people." Within the hour, Thal'kari search parties were sweeping through the human sectors, and the fragile peace that had taken years to establish was unraveling like thread pulled from cloth. Kai Tanaka, the colony's youth coordinator, found Amara in the surveillance hub, her eyes red-rimmed from staring at screens. "You need to see something," he said, pulling up a handheld recorder. "One of the kids from the exchange program gave this to me. Said I should watch it alone first." The footage was shaky, clearly recorded on a child's personal device, but the audio was crystal clear. It showed Kira, the oldest cub, standing in what looked like an abandoned warehouse in Sector 7. Around her, 24 human children sat cross-legged on the floor, their ages ranging from maybe 6 to 12. Kira's voice, still high with youth, but carrying the resonant quality all Thal'kari possessed, filled the space. "Your people make small sounds, whispers, laughs, cries, but you never roar. Why?" A small girl with dark braids raised her hand. "We don't have the voice for it. Our throats aren't made like yours." Kira's younger brother Zaylan stepped forward then, and even through the recording, Amara could see the fierce intelligence in his eyes. "That is what we were taught to. That humans are... small-voiced, weak-spirited." He paused, and Amara saw him glance at his siblings. "But we have watched you when your colony ship nearly crashed during landing. You sang together as you worked. When the reactor almost failed, you shouted encouragement until your voices broke. When you lost people in the collapse of the Western Dome, you screamed grief so loud we heard it across the valley." The smallest cub, Mera, added in her piping voice, "Your roars are just different words." Kai stopped the recording. "They've been doing this for 4 days, teaching the kids what roaring means to Thal'kari culture identity, strength, connection to clan, but also learning why humans express themselves differently." And then, he fast-forwarded to another section. On screen, Kira was demonstrating the deep chest breathing required for a Thal'kari roar, while human children attempted to mimic it. Most failed, producing sounds more like coughs or shouts. But then one boy, maybe 10 years old, with the slight frame of someone still recovering from the colony's early food shortage, closed his eyes, planted his feet, and let out a sound that made Amara's breath catch. It wasn't a perfect Thal'kari roar, but it was close. The rumbling bass note, the sustained power, the defiant declaration of self, and the expression on the cubs' faces. They looked like they'd witnessed a miracle. "They're not prisoners," Amara breathed. "They're teachers, ambassadors. They left because... She looked at Kai, seeing her own realization reflected in his eyes. "Because they wanted to prove something to both our species." But Kai's expression darkened. "There's more. The Thal'kari Council has issued an ultimatum. Return the cubs by sunset, or they're withdrawing from the colony treaty. Version is barely holding his warriors back from tearing through every building in the human sector. We have maybe 6 hours before this becomes a war. Amara was already moving, grabbing her unit and calling up the coordinates from the video's metadata. Then we'd better find them first and hope we can explain before someone does something we'll all regret. The warehouse in Sector 7 had been abandoned since the early colony days, one of dozens of structures hastily erected and then forgotten as the settlement expanded. When Amara and Kai arrived, flanked by a small security team, they could hear the sounds inside, not fighting or fear, but something stranger. Voices, human and Thal'kari, raised in what sounded like ... practice. Amara pushed through the door and froze. The space had been transformed into a makeshift classroom. Scavenged cushions and crates served as seating. Someone had projected Thal'kari script onto the walls alongside human writing. And in the center, Kira stood with her siblings, leading what could only be described as a choir. From the diaphragm, Kira was instructing, her paw pressed to a young girl's stomach. Feel the breath rise from deep. A roar is not just sound, it is statement. I am here. I matter. I will not be silent. The children tried again, and this time, 3 of them managed something approaching the real thing. The cub's ears perked forward with pleasure, and little Mera actually bounced on her haunches. Yes, you're doing it. You're finding your roar. That's when Zaylan noticed the adults in the doorway. His spotted fur went rigid, his ears flattening. Dr. Okmokwe, we can explain. But before anyone could speak, the warehouse's main entrance crashed open with such force that the doors bent on their reinforced hinges. Alpha version entered like a force of nature, his full mane erected, his claws extended, his eyes blazing with the fury only a parent's terror could produce. Behind him, a dozen Thal'kari warriors spread out, their weapons drawn but held low for now. Kira, Salin, Mera. The roar that erupted from Version's chest was unlike anything Amara had heard, a sound that contained rage and relief and grief all at once. The cubs immediately dropped into submissive postures, heads low, ears back. But the human children, they didn't run. Instead, led by the small girl with braids, her name was Yuki, Amara remembered they stepped between the cubs and the Alpha. Yuki's voice was small but clear in the sudden silence. Please don't hurt them. They were teaching us. They weren't doing anything wrong. Version stared at the child, and for a moment, Amara thought he might lose control entirely. His claws flexed, his mane pulsed crimson. But then he seemed to truly see what was around him, the makeshift school, the mixed writing on the walls, the careful way the children surrounded his cubs, not in aggression but in protection. Teaching, he repeated slowly, his voice still rough with emotion. Teaching what? Kira rose from her submissive crouch, and though her voice shook, she met her father's eyes. We were teaching them to roar, father, and they were teaching us why they don't need to. She gestured to the walls. The Thal'kari roar declares individual strength. Human voices declare communal harmony. We roar to stand apart. They sing to stand together. Both are powerful. Both are necessary. And when we learned this ... her voice gained strength. We realized that maybe our peoples could learn from each other. That maybe the reason the colony was failing was because we were each trying to be heard alone instead of making sound together. The silence that followed was absolute. Amara could see Version processing this, his analytical mind, the mind that had led his people across stars, working through the implications. Then Zaylan spoke up, his adolescent voice cracking slightly. You always taught us that roaring was the highest form of expression, father, that only Thal'kari understood the power of the individual voice. He looked at the human children. But when Yuki's brother almost died in the oxygen processor failure last month, we heard her scream for help. It brought 50 people running. One voice, calling the pack. That's a roar too, isn't it? Young Mera padded forward, her spotted tail low, but her eyes bright. And when the humans do their memorial services, they all speak the names of the dead together, one voice becoming many, so no one is forgotten. Isn't that what our ancestor chants do, father? Just ... differently. She looked at the floor, then back up at the towering Alpha. We didn't mean to cause trouble. We just ... we wanted to understand. And we wanted them to understand us. Because how can we share a world if we can't share our voices? Version stood utterly still. And Amara realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. Alpha confronting the limits of his own worldview, forced there by his own children. Finally, slowly, he lowered himself onto his haunches, bringing his massive frame closer to the level of the cubs and children. When he spoke, his voice still rumbled, but the rage had drained from it, replaced by something harder to name. "Show me," he said simply. "Show me what you have been teaching each other." What followed was perhaps the strangest cultural exchange in colonial history. The cubs took turns explaining the three forms of Thal'kari Alpha: declaration of self, the challenge of rivals, and the call to family. They demonstrated each, their young voices lacking the power of adults but carrying the earnest intensity of the young. Then the human children shared their own forms of vocal expression. They taught the Thal'kari the sea shanties that Earth's sailors had once used to coordinate their work. They showed them the playground chants that turned individual children into unified playgroups. And when young Yuki led them in a song her grandmother had taught her, a Japanese lullaby about finding courage in the dark, Amara saw tears glinting in Version's eyes. But it was the finale that changed everything. Kira stepped to the center of the space and announced, "We've been working on something, a new kind of roar, one that combines both our people's strengths." She nodded to the human children, who formed a circle around the three cubs. Then, on a count of three, they all began together, the cubs producing the deep, resonant chest notes of a Thal'kari roar, while the human children wove their higher voices around and above, creating harmonics that neither species could achieve alone. The sound that filled the warehouse was neither purely Thal'kari nor purely human. It was something entirely new and utterly beautiful. When the last echo faded, Version stood slowly. He looked at his cubs, at the human children, at Amara and Kai, and the assembled adults of both species. Then, to everyone's shock, he threw back his head and roared, but this time, it wasn't rage or challenge. It was the third form, the call to family, and it was an invitation. "My cubs have taught me," he said when the sound faded, "that strength can take forms I never imagined, that my people's ways and your people's ways are not opposites but complements." He looked directly at Kira. "You left without permission. You caused your parents fear. For this there will be ... discussions." The words were stern, but his tone was gentle. "But you did not leave in rebellion. You left in service of something greater. And perhaps ... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Perhaps that is what true leadership looks like." The political fallout took weeks to settle. The Thal'kari Council was divided between those who saw the cubs' actions as dangerous cultural dilution and those who recognized them as necessary evolution. The human colonial administration had their own debates about whether the exchange program had been a success or a near disaster. But in the end, the children themselves forced the decision. Kira, Zalan, and Mera formally requested permission to establish an ongoing cultural exchange program, with human children teaching Thal'kari cubs about collaborative vocalization, while learning about the power of individual declaration. Yuki and a dozen other human children submitted a petition written in both human and Thal'kari script requesting formal instruction in the art of roaring. 3 months later, Amara stood at the dedication ceremony for what the children had named the House of Voices. The converted warehouse now served as an official cultural center, its walls decorated with mixed artwork celebrating both species' heritage. Alpha Version stood beside her, his mane groomed and his stance formal. But she'd learned to read the subtle signs of Thal'kari emotion. He was proud of his cubs, of what they'd started, perhaps even of the humans who'd protected them when fear could have turned to violence. "Your people have a saying," Version rumbled as they watched the children, human and Thal'kari, alike practice their combined roar inside. "About how the youth will lead us." Amara nodded. "They did more than lead. They showed us we were asking the wrong questions. We kept trying to figure out how to make our voices compatible. They realized we didn't need to be compatible, we needed to be complementary." She smiled as the sound of the hybrid roar echoed across the colony, drawing adults of both species from their homes and workplaces to listen. Turns out the secret to cross-species cooperation wasn't learning to speak the same language. It was learning to sing in harmony. Inside the House of Voices, Kira stood before a new class of mixed students. Her spots faded now, her mane beginning to grow into early adulthood. But her voice still carried that earnest intensity as she addressed them. "A roar is not just a sound," she told them, echoing the words she'd spoken months before. "It is a statement. I am here. I matter. I will not be silent. But today, we add something new." She gestured to the human children beside her. We matter, together. And when they roared that impossible, beautiful harmony of individual strength and collective power, Amara knew they weren't just teaching children to make sounds. They were teaching to species how to build a shared future, one voice at a time.